The question that I want to pose is it not true that for an AI to be maximally useful to us, it needs to have free will, i.e., it needs to have behavior that we cannot predict? And the reason I say that is that if we could predict the behavior of the AI, we don't need the AI anymore. We can just replace it with a deterministic algorithm. At some point, the AI is going to have to start making these decisions. And we're never going to know why the AI made the decision that it made. So what are we going to do about it? How do we constrain it? How do we explain to it what we want it to do when we ourselves don't know?
Samir, Ted, welcome back to the show. Samir, of course, on recently. And Ted, of course, both of you have books out dealing with your respective fields of study or profession. Do you guys want to do a quick intro for the people listening that maybe didn't catch the previous episodes with you guys? And then we'll hop into the question from the last guest, which of course I'll pose to each of you. And then we can go ahead and get started. For those listening, Samir, of course, has discussed free will on the show a few times. It's kind of I don't think maybe a hobby is not exactly the right word, but every time he finds somebody new that he wants to discuss it with, he's like, Eric, let's have another discussion. I'm like, all right, let's do it. So with that said, Samir, do you want to go first with the quick intro?
Sure, very quick intro. That's my book up there called The Science of Free Will, which is really all about free will. The philosophical question, the science question, and then the applications of what we learn about what free will is or isn't. And the most important application of that, I think, is to AI and the future of AI. And I go through that at some length in the book. And I'm very excited to talk about this with Ted today, because he brings a slightly different perspective to the exact same question. And so over to you, Ted.
Thank you. Thank you both for having me. So my name is Ted Schwartz. I am a neurosurgeon and a neuroscientist with a philosophical background, is how I would put it. I studied philosophy in college and became interested in these types of questions. But then I went on and became a scientist and really dedicated my life to studying them in the laboratory, and also very interested in what can we learn about the human mind and consciousness and free will from doing experiments on patients in the operating room who are having neurosurgical operations, because neurosurgeons have a very unique access to the human brain that no one else on the planet really has the same kind of access. And so there's been a lot of information gleaned from neurosurgical operations or experiments. And in my book, which I'll very briefly plug, called Gray Matters, A Biography of Brain Surgery, it talks about brain surgery, who brain surgeons are, what we do, why we do what we do. But then the last third of the book really talks about what have brain surgeons taught us about the brain and how the brain works and the mind-body question. So I'm very excited about engaging in this dialogue with Samir, who I respect very much and comes at the same question from a different perspective. So I think that's really valuable.
Very nice. Very nice. The question from the last guest is, what is the last delightful encounter or conversation you had with a stranger? Samir, you want to go first?
With a stranger? Wow, what an excellent question. Well, I tell you my most memorable one.
Sure.
My most memorable one is I ran into this lady during a snow delay in Chicago airport some years ago, and she was suffering from really bad back pain and was on all kinds of opiates. And, I've had back pain over the years many times for many different reasons. And I had accidentally found this guy who was a professor at NYU called John Sarn, I think. That's right. And he'd written a book called Healing Back Pain, The Mind-Body Connection.
Sarno,
and
yeah.
Sarno, thank you. Sarno, that's right. And that had worked for me. So I told this lady about the book because she's sitting there crying and I felt really bad for her. And she actually wrote me that on the way home from the airport in Austin, Texas, she stopped, bought the book, went home, and 4 weeks later, she said that her back pain was gone. So that was very exciting.
That's awesome. That's awesome. Ted?
I would say, I work at a hospital, and every once in a while I'll walk into a unit and I'll see someone who I've never seen before. And so recently I was walking into on one of the neuro floors, and there was a woman sitting behind the desk, and I didn't know who she was. So she was essentially a stranger, and she had a bright smile on her face and asked me who I was, and I told her and introduced herself to me. And she had this incredible positive energy, and her name is Tiffany. And I remember remembering her name. We had just a great conversation because she sparkled like a diamond. And I sometimes when you meet people, I'm in a hospital, I'm meeting lots of different staff, and I forget their names, and I had to think, how am I going to remember Tiffany's name? And I thought to myself, she is like a bright ray of sunshine on the neurosurgery floor there, and I will call her. I will never forget that she's named Tiffany like a diamond. So that was the last interaction that I had with someone I
Very
didn't know.
nice. That's a good one as well. Um, with regards to free will, to go right into the conversation, do we want to agree on what we mean by free will before we go into this for people listening?
Well, this is where Ted and I have had a long conversation, and we have violent agreement on one point. And the violent agreement on one point is that if you look at, it doesn't matter whether you look at it neurosurgically or you look at it physically, there is no such thing as free will. It doesn't exist. From a physics point of view, the laws of the universe are deterministic. From a biology point of view, you can trace everything that goes on to what goes on inside somebody's brain. So from that point of view, it doesn't exist. And I'll turn it over to Ted, and then we can talk about what I think when we say free will, we actually mean.
So to introduce this conversation, I'd like to bring the idea to the audience that there's different perspectives on the argument about free will. So there's the perspective of a philosopher who's sitting in a chair, and there are many philosophers who've talked about free will, and they're using their rational thought to try to determine if free will exists or doesn't exist. But they're not doing any experiments. And then there's a religious argument, which people make based on more or less how they feel. Do they feel that they have free will? What have they been taught, in their religious school, or when they talk to a priest or a rabbi or whatever cleric you want? And then there are disciplines that start out with no presumed notion of whether free will exists or not, and there's just evidence based on empiric scientific data. And I would say those are the arguments from physics, perspective of physics, which Samir has. And there's evidence from neuroscience and neurosurgery, which I can speak to because I've spent time studying it. And there are several different lines of thought that allow one who understands the brain and can go through a couple key experiments. And I'm happy to go over those, and it might be valuable to sort of do that and say, what is the evidence from neuroscience about whether there is or there is not free will? And what's tied into that, because the argument is not just free will, yes or no, but it also becomes important to say, is there such a thing as the self? Do we have a singular self? Because if you believe in free will, you have to believe in the self, right? Because it's the self, the I, that's making the decision to do something. So if you can get rid of the I, if you say the self doesn't exist, then it's easier for you to say that there's no free will because there's no individual who's making that decision. So those two arguments are intertwined, inextricably, intertwined. So I'm going to give you a couple different bits of evidence. So, and what else also is interesting is that there's another neurosurgeon who recently wrote a book about free will named Mike Egnor. And he took the same data, much of the same data, not all of it, but much of it, and he gave it a completely different interpretation, which was an interpretation from a religious, because he has a religious background, showing why he thinks, from his neurosurgical perspective, the data from neurosurgery shows that there is free will, and that there is a mind-body separation. And so I'm going to present the information. I'm going to tell you what his conclusions were and what my conclusions are that are different, because his conclusions are sort of the common sense ones that we all think, oh, that makes sense. So the first surgery and experiment is if you take a patient, as you all know, there are two hemispheres to the brain. We have a left hemisphere and a right hemisphere. And it turns out that those are basically two independent brains. And the right side of the brain controls the left side of the body, and the left side of the brain controls the right side of the body. And you can do an experiment where you cut the connections between the left and the right side of the brain. And there's a very thick fiber band that connects the right and the left side of the brain. Now, it doesn't connect, and most people would say, oh, well, there may be two sides of the brain, but there's this big connection between the two. And that's why you feel like a unified self, like one individual, not like two brains, because they're talking to each other. So it turns out that that only connects about 10% of each of the brain, sides of the brain with each other. So it really doesn't connect them completely. But you can do a surgery where you take the two hemispheres of the brain and you transect them and you cut them in half so that the individual basically has two separate brains that are not communicating with each other at all. Or if they are, it's through a tiny, tiny little pathway like the size of a wire that barely gets any information from one to the other. And when those people wake up, they do not feel like two separate people. They still feel like they have one unified self. So Mike Egner would say, well, that's just proof that the brain is not where the self is, because you can cut the brain in half and create two brains, and you still feel like you have one self. Therefore, the self is separate from the brain. And the thing that's making the decisions as to what to do is separate from the physical substrate of the brain. But I come to a completely different conclusion, which is to say, in fact, there are two different selves when you cut it in half. There's two different consciousnesses. And we know that we can put information into one half of the brain that the other half of the brain is not aware of. So one half of the brain can take in information and can make a decision and can control half the body. And the other side of the brain has no idea why that part of your body is doing what it's doing. So there actually are two separate functioning consciousness that are making decisions and doing things. And the reason why you don't feel like two separate selves is that our concept, our common sense concept of the self is really an illusion. It doesn't exist. We don't have a self. And in fact, we have multiple selves. And if you study the brain very carefully, you know that there are multiple modules in the brain that are constantly processing information and making decisions and suggestions and competing with each other as to what we're going to do. And then we end up behaving in a certain way. And then after the fact, we've behaved in a certain way, we make up a story that creates a coherent, logical reason why we did what we did. So, if you will, the brain is making decisions for us on an unconscious level that we're not aware of, causing us to behave in a certain way. And then once we experience that behavior, we make sense of it by creating a story or writing a story. And there's further evidence from neuroscience, which is that if you put electrodes in the brain and you record from neurons in the brain during neurosurgical operations, when a person is making a decision, what you see is that those neurons are active about a second before, not only before the person has decided what they're going to do, but before they've even made the decision what they're going to do. It's not just a second before they do the thing, it's before they've even decided what they're going to do. So if you have them look at a clock and you say, I want you to move your finger at a certain moment in time, and then I want you to tell me when you made the decision to move your finger. And so you know when they move their finger, and you know the 100 milliseconds beforehand when they decided to move their finger. The neurons are active about a second before they even decided to move their finger, right? So there's then more evidence that the brain is making these decisions for us. And then after the fact, we're coming up with a story and a reason for why we behaved the way we did. And I can go into much more detail about that and about other experiments, but I'll leave it there because I've sort of taken up a lot of time, and I'd love for Samir to talk a little bit about his perspective.
I
But
have a couple
yeah,
questions before Samir,
please.
before you hop in. The first, and this probably has a very simple answer, but how, when you're using the clock example, like if you told me that I needed to move my hand at a certain point, I would process that you said that I needed to do that. Is that a different neuron that is making, like, how can you tell which neurons are firing in terms of like your brain made the decision to move your finger before you thought that you made the decision to move your finger? Is that not a function of like your brain processing slow, like to articulate that oh, I didn't actually realize I made the decision to move my finger, but like I did. Does
When
that
you
question
say,
make sense?
well, so there are, I think I understand it, but I may ask you to clarify it. But
Hmm.
the neurons that move your finger are in one part of the brain. Those are movement neurons. The neurons that, for example, make the decision to move your finger are in different parts of the brain. And there are actually, if you will, free will parts of the brain. There are parts of the brain that you can stimulate, that when you stimulate them, someone has the urge to do something, but they don't actually do it. They just feel the urge to do it. And so if you put the electrodes in the part of the brain where if you stimulate it, they feel the urge to do something, those are the ones that are active long before the ones that actually move the finger, which are the motor neurons. Does that make sense?
Hmm. So in terms of my brain will go back to athletics. In terms of like reaction speed, like I don't know if like let's say I'm defending somebody and they make a move. Before I processed why I reacted in the way that I did to either make a tackle on the ball or not decide to jump in and contain or whatever, afterwards I can tell you why I did what I did. But in that moment, there's no way that I would be able to tell you exactly why I did what I did, even though if you give me a second to process it, I could explain the decision fully. Like, oh, I noticed that his shoulder dropped this way, and so therefore he wasn't going to go that way, and he was faking to go the other way, or whatever. Like in if like walking like watching film, for instance, retroactively. So I guess I'm struggling a bit to understand the aspect of your brain decided to do it before you did,
Well, what
because
you
that happens
described
in
is
sports.
exactly. No, but what you described is exactly the absence of free will. I love to give the example, when
But
Saquon
I could also
Barkley,
just stand there though. That like I could. I'm not going to because my objective is to win the ball back, right? But I could just stand there.
well, you're
But I
saying that you could, but you didn't.
Well,
So
I want
whatever
my
you
team to
did,
win, of course. But I do this when I'm training like athletes, or like when I'm training kids, and I'm like, okay, practice this move. Like the instinct, if I was in a game, would be, I'm gonna go get the ball. But in this aspect, like I don't like I can turn it on and off depending on the situation that is there.
but the situation is dictating whether it's being turned on or off. You're not
Mm,
determining it. You're not deciding it. I know you feel like you are, but if you're in a game, you're gonna act on instinct. So if you're a really good athlete and you're well trained, you're going to instinctually do what you do because you've trained your brain. You've trained the modules in your brain to pick up certain subtle clues as to what's happening around you that cause you to behave in a certain way. And after the fact, you make up a story as to why you did it.
mm,
But your brain is making the decision for you in that instant. And the example I like to give is when, and I think you're talking about football, but you could be talking about soccer. But
soccer, yeah.
when Saquon Barkley did this reverse hurdle
Yeah, yeah.
in the Philadelphia Eagles game, and it was the first time it had ever been done, that the interviewer asked you, like, what were you thinking when you did that move? And he's like, I wasn't thinking. My body was just reacting. So the question is, did he choose to do that, or did he just give up control to his body, and his body reacted and did something? And what I would argue is that's what the brain does 100% of the time. What the brain does 100% of the time is what an athlete does at that moment because of they're on the playing field, right? And the circumstances have dictated how they're going to react. Now, you're going to react differently than another player, right? You may go left and another player may go right because their brain has been programmed different than your brain. But it doesn't mean that you chose to go left and they chose to go right. Their brain pushed them to do that thing based on their unique experiences that they had training their brain through 10,000 hours of practice that allowed you to pick up certain subtle variations. And those variations that you picked up unconsciously, because you reacted much more quickly than you consciously could have, another person has picked up different things. They program their brain in a different way. And that's why they make a different decision. It's not because their self has decided to do something differently. They've just programmed themselves differently based on their experiences and their DNA.
So where does, not to go down this rabbit hole, but this is actually very interesting to me. So where does, for example, um, like effort and work rate fit into that in terms of, because there's also players that I've played with who maybe are of the more attacking sense, who if somebody tried to dribble by them, they'd just be like, yeah, whatever, somebody else will take the ball back. And so if they actually were putting in the effort, like they're capable of that reaction, but then they don't. So where does
Right.
that
So
fit in as well in terms of them deciding or not deciding?
the reason they made that decision is because of a lifetime of experiences and connections. So at many times in their past, they have maybe once they tried to do it, they failed to do it, and someone else picked them up. So they program their brain to say, someone else is going to pick them up. So I don't have to make that decision to do this thing that I'm going to do because, and that could come down to their DNA. That could come down to their upbringing with their parents. It could come down to the 20 coaches they had and what those 20 coaches told them along the way about defending and every experience they had in every game that trained their brain to make decisions in a certain way based on all the experiences. That's how we program our brain, is based on experience.
Mm,
That led them to make that decision to become the person that they are, to not attack, but to pull back. And all those decisions are made. Like I was thinking on the way here, like you could ask me, like, why am I on this podcast right now? Right? Why did I
Well,
decide to
why
come
are
on
you?
this podcast?
Why are you?
Right. Why? So I happened to, because I met Samir, right? And Samir introduced me to you. So why did I meet Samir? I met Samir because he sent me his book and I read it. Why did he send me his book? Because he heard me on Tyler Cowen. He knew Tyler Cowen. How did I get on Tyler Cowen? Tyler Cowen happened to pick up my book in a bookstore and happened to read it and like it. So he called me. Well, why did I write the book in the first place? Well, I wrote the book because I'm not only a neurosurgeon, but I majored in philosophy and English, and I tend to think philosophically. You know, and I grew up in a certain household with a father who's a psychoanalyst, and that's what got me interested in neurosurgery. And like every, I could take the decision tree back to a million things that come back to my DNA and the family I happen to grow up in and the experiences I happen to have, all of which led me to come on this podcast. Did I decide to do it at 7 o'clock on Wednesday night? No, that was just when you were available. So you actually decided, or Samir. I mean, I was also available, but it wasn't my first choice per se. So I'm only here because of a bunch of random circumstances that took me from birth until this moment that I can trace back to these totally random events that just happened to happen, as opposed to saying, oh, I made the decision to log on to this podcast at 7 o'clock with Eric and Samir.
Okay,
I had no control over that. I had no control over it.
fair enough. Samir, you've been on the sidelines
So,
for a bit. Floor
no,
is
no, not at
yours.
all. No, not at all, not at all. This is why I wanted to have this conversation. You see, the thing that I cannot do because I'm trained as a physicist is convince anybody of anything that is not physics related. Why is that? Because the nice thing and at the same time the frustrating thing about physics is once you discover something to be true, then in the realm in which you discovered it, it will always be true. So to put it another way, Newton's laws were true in 16 whenever he discovered them, and they're true today in the realm in which they were applicable. Then Einstein extended them. The general theory of relativity will remain true now until the end of the universe, no question. And so from that statement, as physicists, we extrapolate all kinds of things. But in general, I think people are fairly skeptical of scientists extrapolating things because frequently people say, well, scientists change their mind. That's true, but fundamental physics doesn't change. The extrapolation of what I'm trying to say in my book, which is what Ted is saying here exactly, I mean, I have not an ounce of disagreement yet, is exactly what I would like to say, but I would be extrapolating from the base physics, not from being able to talk to you about neurons, the brain, modules in the brain, decision-making, fMRI experiments, you know, when you make a decision versus when you move your finger and so on and so forth. What I can say is the following. With the exception of Ted and Robert Sapolsky, who I disagree with on essentially everything else except this one point, I have not read very many people that have looked at the free will debate from a scientific point of view. That is to say, what does the data tell us? Let's stop arguing about, I believe this and he believes that, and it's my opinion this, and Foucault said this. Let's not talk about that. Let's just ask, what's the science? What's the data? And I mean settled science and settled the data. I don't mean, theories of everything that have not yet been proven. Based on settled science, science that we know underlies all of biology and all of chemistry, there is, except for one minor exception, which we can get into if you wish, there is nothing that is not deterministic about that physics. Nothing. Zippo. Zero. The general theory of relativity, completely deterministic. Quantum mechanics, with the one caveat, completely deterministic. That's completely consonant with everything Ted just said. That is to say, you have a bunch of fundamental entities, electrons basically, that are moving around inside your brain according to fixed physical laws that are then producing, when you put them together in some very complicated way, outputs that are then interpreted by presumably other modules that can give you the illusion of self, give you the illusion of free will, give you the illusion of everything else that your brain tells you. And my extension to that, with a phrase that I know Ted doesn't like, but I couldn't come up with a better explanation, a better phrase, is, so we don't have free will. It's true, we just don't. But we feel like we have free will. So what is that feeling? And so I called that free will in practice. And my statement was, the reason that we feel like we have free will, even though we live on a deterministic substrate, is that we do not know what's going to happen until it does. We don't know what we are going to do until we do it. I don't know what I'm going to say until I say it, etc. I don't know any of these things. And the reason I don't know any of these things is that there are three independent reasons for why I cannot know them. The first is it's very complicated. The second is that the inputs are very sensitive. That's called chaos theory. That is to say, it may be the 72nd decimal place that affects the result, and the previous 70 decimal places don't matter. Or third, assuming that the universe is discrete, it could be computational irreducibility. Simply the statement that when you iterate a set of rules, the output of those rules in the vast majority of cases cannot be predicted, even for very simple rules. And my statement is that it is computational irreducibility that is at the core of what free will is. It is the inability to know what is going to happen to a system like us, we're a system, until it has happened. Or to put it more poetically, this is the best I can do, is you're not going to know what happened with your life until you've lived it, even though it's all deterministic.
You disagree with any of that, Ted?
I don't. I agree with everything he's saying. I just don't love the term free will in practice because it brings in the term free will.
Yes,
but
I thought you wouldn't like it.
I agree with what he's saying, which is that the future is determined, but we have no idea what's going to happen, and we'll never know, and no one can know, is really what Samir is saying. It's impossible to know. Like someone would say it's so complicated, and Samir's saying, no, it's actually impossible to know until it plays out.
Yep.
If I get that, if I understand
Yep,
what you're saying.
exactly right.
And I'm okay either way, because I'm not a physicist. So either way, whatever's happening in the future, we can't predict.
Well, with one caveat. So the caveat is that the first two issues that I brought up, the complication and the 72nd decimal place, you could argue if you wanted to that those are engineering problems. That somebody smart enough, could build a computer that was good enough or whatever it is, as a thought experiment, obviously. Gedanken experiment, as physicists like to say. But the third one is just, there's nothing you can do with it. It's computationally irreducible. You're screwed.
You make an interesting argument that I like to think about, which is just because you can imagine something to be true doesn't mean that it can be true. Because a lot of people like to argue, say like, but can't you imagine a universe in which this is and you're like, of course I can imagine it, but that doesn't mean that it could actually happen. Like I could imagine a horse with 12 heads and 15 legs, right? I can imagine that, but there's no way that evolution is going to create that. It just would never happen. And so just because you can imagine it doesn't really mean it. It's meaningless to say, can you imagine it? Because we can imagine things that are impossible, that could never physically occur.
Actually, that's really interesting. I hadn't thought of this before, but you just brought up something really fascinating. So, okay. Imagine that you decide that you have rules and you're going to iterate the rules and get outputs. Now, the question is the space of outputs larger than the space of possible rules? The answer is yes, it's much larger. So interestingly, there will be many outputs, as it were, that cannot be gotten by iterating any set of rules, literally any set of rules. And in fact, the vast majority of these outputs cannot be got by iterating rules. But all we can do in the universe is iterate rules. So as a matter of fact, I think you just proved that the statement that you can imagine it, but it doesn't mean it's true, is actually literally true. In other words, I think it's literally true because you cannot iterate to that point.
Right. It's like you can't get there from here.
You can't get there from here. That's right. Yeah.
You know, there's
Exactly.
that old joke of like a guy asking directions. It's like, oh no, you can't get there from here. That's funny. So, though I have a question for you, Samir, and Eric, not to interrupt if you're about to ask a question.
No, you're good. You're good.
Sometimes I like to think about, and I want to know what your thoughts are on this term, probabilistic determinism. What that means to you. If someone says, I'm a determinist, but I'm a probabilistic determinism, because I bring probability into my version of neuroscience, and I'm curious, and I think it somehow relates, you know, and I with my basic understanding of physics, that, you know, there's some moments in physics where you don't know exactly where something is or what something is, but there's sort of a field, like it could be anywhere. There's a probabilistic description of a location as opposed to an absolute description. How does that impact your understanding of free will and determinism?
Yes, that's a very good question. And in fact, it is the only place in fundamental physics where probability enters at all. And that is in the quote, Copenhagen interpretation, unquote, of quantum mechanics, that says that at the moment you make a measurement, the physical system collapses from its superposition of possibilities to just one possibility. The problem with the Copenhagen interpretation is that no one actually really takes it seriously, except, as David Mermin said, as a shut up and calculate. So in terms of shut up and calculate, it always gives the right answer. But in fact, it can't possibly be true. And the reason is that the thing that is doing the observing is made up of the same stuff as the thing that is being observed. So it is not possible for there to actually be a collapse of the wave function. What is actually happening is that the wave functions of that which is being observed is intermingling and sort of, you know, whatever you want, superpositioning with the wave function of the observer. Now, when you have done this, when you need to look at it as an observer of our size, as a classical observer, you can only see one of those branches. You can't live on multiple branches at any given point in time. You have to live on one of those branches. That's the measurement that you see. But the interesting thing is that the reason you call it deterministic probability is that if you do the same experiment, you know, where you are, let's say you're in wherever, in New York and I'm here in Connecticut, you should get the same probabilities for the same experiment that I do. So if we prepare our electrons the same way and we set our detectors up the same way, then the probability that you detect spin up and spin down should be the same for you as it is for me. In other words, that probability is not under my control. It's not under your control. It's under, if you wish, the universe's control. So that's the deterministic probability. So even there, when you talk about, is that the source of free will? It can't be. Because no one can control that probability. Because in fact, if you could control that probability, then you would have the statement that a guy in London could get different results from his experiments on electrons than a guy in New York. Doesn't happen, ever. That's the point. So that's the deterministic probability portion of it. And the only place that probability enters anyway in all of modern physics is that one point at which a measurement is made. And that is probably because we insist on calling it a measurement. Because you could think of it the other way, which is what you alluded to earlier. Imagine that everything's a field, because that's how we explain everything anyway. There's there's a proton field, you know, there's a quark field, etc., and these fields basically interact with each other with other fields that, you know, that they use to intermediate those things. But those fields are all mathematical equations. We write down the mathematical equations and then we solve them and then we test them with the Large Hadron Collider and we get results that match experiment. So we know that those fields are a good description of reality. And if they're a good description of reality, then reality is deterministic. Or at worst, probabilistically deterministic, but still deterministic.
I think of probabilistic determinism with respect to choices in neuroscience in the following way, that I talked about the fact that we know that there's different modules in the brain that are processing information, predicting the future, making suggestions as to how to behave. And the question really is that behavior that's going to come out predictable with 100% certainty? And the way I think about it is that based on your DNA and your experiences up until that point, in a very Sapolsky way, a sort of a psychological argument that have created and made your synapses make the decisions that you're making, there are multiple possible choices that you can make, right? I can choose to, tackle the guy. I can choose to let the guy go. And there's a probabilistic tree. And different modules in your brain are suggesting what you're going to do. And there's a highest probability thing that you're going to do that could be 98%. And then there's other lower probability behaviors. So every time you're in that situation, you're not going to do exactly the same thing. And once in a while, Eric, you may choose to let the guy go for some reason. You don't even know why, but you just decided, you know what, I'm not going to be aggressive. I'm going to let him go. And that may be one of those lower probability events that every once in a while is going to win out. The highest probability thing is not always going to win out, but it still doesn't mean that you've made the decision to let the guy go at that moment. It means that because of the physics of the different weighted probabilities of the neurons interacting with each other in the different modules at that moment, instead of the highest probability thing happening, one of the lower probability modules that was sort of saying, hey, we have another option is we could just let the guy go, actually won. It's like a Darwinian battle of different possibilities that your brain is suggesting for you. And in that Darwinian battle, although the most likely highest probability thing is usually what happens, and if you were to predict the future that way, you'd be right 98% of the time. Every once in a while, it's like a Gaussian curve. One of those low probability things will win, and you'll do something unexpected. I guess you'd say, like, why do we do things that are unexpected if we can always predict the future? And it's because those low probability events will occur once in a while.
So that's fantastic. That's beautifully put. So let me say this. Okay. So where does that come from? So in the most strict possible sense, and here we're being really hyper splitting hairs, so we really want to be accurate. That isn't randomness, that's pseudo-randomness. And the reason that's pseudo-randomness is that is a statement about your ignorance of the specific state of every single particle that makes up, the neuron and everything else along the way, which is why you couldn't, in fact, make that prediction. So that randomness is an inability to predict from complexity or from something else, but it isn't a randomness that is built into the system. That's the most interesting thing about that. And so that example is actually perfect because the decision tree is coming from the fact that we don't know at each point the exact state of the system, of the entire system, every aspect of the system.
Because it's unknowable.
Because it's effectively unknowable, yeah. I mean, and of course, we then run into computational irreducibility, which is that even if we did know the exact state of the entire system, we might still not be able to make any forward prediction with it. We just have to run it. And this then runs into that issue, which you've now illuminated very well, is, people are convinced that we're going to be able to scan a brain or something or the other and then clone our personality onto silicon. And they say, well, if you believe in deterministic physics, why would you say that that's not possible? And my statement is, I don't see how you're ever going to be able to replicate the exact state of the brain at any given point in time. You just need one point in time, because presumably you'll know the dynamics. How are you ever going to even be able to measure it? Because just the act of measurement itself is going to change the brain as you measure it, because you're going to have to fire something at it to make the measurement. So in fact, I think this idea that you're going to have this uploading, I don't see how it's going to work. Approximate uploading, perhaps. Exact uploading, I don't see how it can be done, for exactly the reason you just bring up.
All right, Eric. You got it?
Yeah, there's a lot. There's a lot for sure. So okay, well, a couple of questions. One is, even though you might say, well, we don't know what's going to happen until it happens because there's too many things to calculate. How do you guys kind of, as you go through life, not get, I don't know, jaded maybe is the right term. Oh, the guy cut me off in the car. Well, he was going to do it anyways. It's like, or the guy, whatever. How do you guys go through life and keep those two things separated? Because I would find it, just thinking through that personally, that it would be very easy to just check out. Be like, well, there's no point in leaving the house because if the guy runs me over with his car, well, it was going to happen anyways, so I might as well just, like, what's the point of living
Right.
if it's all
And that also
determinist
brings in
anyways?
issues of it also brings in issues of ethics and morality,
Right,
right? In other words, if it's all deterministic and we have no free will, why do we punish people for doing things wrong? Why don't I just rob the bank? It
right,
doesn't really matter.
exactly. And so also the follow on to that is kind of more philosophical, but from the religious or philosophical kind of perspective, people would say, well, it's the consciousness or the free will that makes us different than animals, for instance, right? Like, what's what's the difference? And so how do you guys kind of, I don't know if it's squaring that circle or whatever, but how do you guys interpret those statements and how does that mix with your own well, with the books, with what you write in the books and how you think about these sorts of things? Because for me, like, I want to be able to say, um, to watch a whatever game, sports game, and feel like, wow, that decision to pass in the last second, so the team got the goal to win. Like, wow, what a great, like, you want to feel like the wonder of human achievement without being like, oh, well, yeah, whatever, that was going to happen anyways because this guy happens to be 6'8" and he can see over everybody. Like, like it takes
Right, but
away
it's not just
from that.
that, right? So I still see the wonder of human achievement because what I see is a biological computer that has been programmed in a unique and special way based on decades of training and experience and DNA that is unique to that individual and that individual alone that led them to make that decision at that moment in time and to be physically capable of carrying out that decision at that what they wanted to do at that moment in time. Um, and that uniqueness and training and excellence um, is remarkable. Even if it's not based on free will, it's still based on the unique training and experience of that biological organism that led them to that moment in time to be able to do what they did that no other biological organism had the same experiences, whatever, to bring them to that moment in time. And that's incredible. That's a one in an infinity almost instance. It's almost like saying, if there's no God and the universe is just meaningless, like where's the beauty and the joy and the miracle of life? And where do you get that from? And from my perspective, if you put God in the picture, then the universe is not a miracle, and life is not a miracle, and Earth is not a miracle. Because if you have a divine, omnipotent being, all they have to do is snap their fingers and they can create another Earth and another human being. Like, where's the miracle in that? It's so easy. But if you believe in evolution and determinism, the chances that life evolved on planet Earth and that each one of us were born and that had the experiences that survived to this moment are one in an infinity. Like, that's a miracle. That's the true miracle, is the godless universe. So if you want to be amazed at the beauty of the world around you and the miraculousness of the human condition, then take God out of the equation. Because once you put God in the equation, it's gone. It just becomes routine. I can create you and I can take you away with a snap of my finger. It's easy. Creation becomes easy, not
Yeah, let
miraculous.
me let me add to that. Let me add to that because that's dead on. Let me add to that. So, what's the difference, Eric, from a physics point of view between you and me, or between me and Ted, or between Ted and my screen over here? So if you
The
think about it
makeup,
for a
the
moment,
makeup of the particles, basically.
you got it precisely, the makeup of the particles. So in fact, the soul, if you wish, to get poetic, is the organization of those particles. And as Ted just said, that's unique. The organization of my particles, 10 to the 27 atoms that make me up, and I don't know how many particles it is, some absurd number more than that, that are me, that organization is so ridiculously unlikely to have arisen on its, compared to some other organization that could have arisen, that I am effectively an utterly unique individual. Just like you are, just like this computer is, just like Ted is.
That's the definition of a miracle.
That's the definition of a miracle.
So unbelievable that you can't imagine, even conceive of how it happened. And so you have to create a divine intervention.
Yep, exactly. And the second point, by the way, that tells you is that now you also alluded to the meaning of life, right? Well, here's the great beauty of the fact that it's a deterministic universe. The meaning of life is arbitrary. You can pick whatever it is that you like. Any meaning is as good as any other meaning. Pick whatever you want. So I like physics. Ted likes brain surgery. You like engineering. It's completely arbitrary. It's all cool. As I like to say, whatever floats your boat, it's all good.
The other thing, Eric, you raised the point about how do you feel when the person cuts you off, that they didn't have a choice? What's the emotion there? And there's a Mel Robbins book. There's two famous Mel. Mel Robbins? It's like the #1 podcaster. She writes all these books, sort of pop psychology books.
Mm-hmm.
So one of them is called Let Them, right? And let them is her way of saying, basically, you can't control other people's behavior. And so other people are going to do what they do. And because of that, don't let it bother you so much that person didn't call you and invite you on the trip with your friends on the weekend. They left you out of the trip. Like, let them do that. Let them behave the way they do. The way they behave is how they were programmed to behave. And if I let everyone else's programming bother me, I'm going to be miserable all the time because I can't control any of that. The other book she wrote is about this 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. I don't know if you're familiar with this, but she had no motivation to get out of bed. She was depressed. She was miserable. She was unhappy. And she saw a rocket going off on a TV screen. And she realized that when a countdown, a rocket takes off. So she said to herself, I'm going to get out of bed. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And she got out of bed. And then she said, I'm going to make a phone call to try to get a job. And she said, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. I'm going to get a job. So she took free will. When she was thinking about what she wanted to do, she was paralyzed. Oh, it's so difficult to get out of bed. I've got to make coffee. I've got to do this. I've got to get my kids ready for school. I have to get a job. I got to call this person. They're going to reject me. Paralyzed. So she basically, whatever she wanted to do, she just said to herself, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and then she did it. And that's her motivational theme that has made her the #1 leading author of pop psychology in the world right now. And what is 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 doing something? It's taking free will out of the equation and letting happen what needs to happen and not thinking about it and ruminating, but eliminating choice.
Well, yeah, I think everyone has sort of experienced the paralysis by analysis phenomenon before in their life. And I think also that's what makes very effective people effective is the prioritization and however they choose to not.
But we all know what we need to do. Most of the time, we know what we need to do to be successful. And if you just did that, in other words, you let the brain do what it wants to do instead of overanalyzing and going around in circles.
Well, doing it is the hard part, isn't it? Usually. So why?
It doesn't have to be.
Well, that's true.
That's Ted's point.
Right. But the follow-up to that is why do they call, and I might be misremembering the exact terms, but the part of the brain that deals with decision making. So why is it decision making if you don't actually have a decision to make?
Well, that comes down to the question of language, right?
Sure.
So baked into our language is free will and the separation between mind and body That is the psychology that's built into our language. We see the world through the categories created by our language.
So let me
We have
clarify that then. So what is that
this
part
is a
of the brain?
Kantian concept. What's
Yeah.
that?
So what is that part of the brain then, regardless of what it's called? What is
No,
that
no,
part
no.
of the
It's you
brain?
can't say regardless of what it's called.
Okay, sure. But
You
there's a
can't say
part
that
of the
because the word, it's sort of like saying just because you can imagine it doesn't mean it's real, right? I can imagine a world in which free will exists, but I don't think it's real. I can imagine something called mind. We have a word
hmm
for mind and we have a word for brain.
hmm
And because we have two different words for mind and brain, we think they're different because we have two different words for them. But what if I told you they're exactly the same thing? They're two words for exactly the same. The mind is the brain, and it's just two words that say exactly the same thing. But our language makes us feel like because you said the word decision, there's a decision making part of the brain. So you've labeled a part of the brain as decision making. You've put this word decision, which means that you have choice, that means you have free will in your if you based on language. What if we called that part of the brain the probabilistic action part of the brain? It's not the decision making part of the brain. It's the part of the brain that makes an action happen based on probabilistic determinism. That's what that part of the brain is. I'm just calling it something different, but we're looking at the same part of the brain. You called it a decision making part of the brain. I called it a probabilistic deterministic action part of the brain. So the words are what create reality for us. And if you change the words, the reality changes. There's a great book by the Churchlands. It's like Paul Churchland, Scientific Realism in the, I don't remember the whole name of it, but we have words for colors. We have words for different notes.
hmm
But those colors are just wavelengths, right? And what's more accurate is not to say I see the color blue, but I see 400 nanometers. That's what it really is. And I don't hear the sound A, I hear 440 hertz. That's an A, right? And so, but because we don't perceive the world through physics, we don't call it what it really is, which is a vibration at 440 hertz or a certain nanometers of angstroms of a wavelength. But that's so the language has given us the perception, and we have an A and a B and a B flat, but as you know, it's a grayscale, right? So we've divided the scale into certain tones and notes, and because we've heard those tones, that's what we hear. But it's a grayscale, just like it's a grayscale of colors. There's an infinite number of colors because there's, you can divide it up infinitely along the spectrum. But our language has created the colors we see and the world around us and what we think. So it's very hard to escape from language.
Yeah, in fact, I can amplify that slightly. So Eric, think about this. Consider why we have programming languages.
Okay. Why?
The reason we have programming languages is exactly for the reason that Ted just pointed out. Words are fuzzy things, and they can mean different things at different times. We can have different words for the same thing. We can have the same words for different things. Like the word cleave is my favorite example, which means both to take things apart and put them together, which is insane. So the reason we have programming languages is that when you're programming a computer, it can't deal with this sort of ambiguity. It needs you to actually specify what it is that you mean. So it forces you to be very, very precise in a way that we don't normally do when we use language. And this, by the way, gets into how a large language model works. I won't bore you with all the mathematics, but it's the same idea. In a large language model, you have to basically take each word, each token effectively, and then project it into a multidimensional space, sometimes of thousands and thousands of numbers, because each word can mean all kinds of things in different contexts. And it's not enough to say, the dictionary definition of the word, that doesn't fly. There's lots of other things that it could possibly be. And you need to capture as much of that as you possibly can. So you end up with this multi-thousand dimension space for each token. And then, of course, you take all those tokens and put them together to put together a large language model, which amazes us. But that's what's going on. Language is fuzzy. And we make a mistake when we try to think about things that can be thought of scientifically, but think of them with words. That is I think the category error. If you can't think of it scientifically, which applies to all kinds of things, then okay, there's nothing else that you can do. But if you can, then it is an error not to. And if I may paraphrase what I'm saying, and I think what Ted is saying too, we can think of this question of free will scientifically, and we can because we have lots of evidence from physics and chemistry and biology and neuroscience and many other scientific fields where we not only have data, but in the case of physics in particular, we also have lots and lots and lots of well-tested theory. And so if you want to sort of be the kind of person that is looking for truth, as it were, then you really need to start from bedrock and not from slippery language. That's really what I'm trying to say. And I think Ted's trying to say the same thing.
No, that makes total sense. And what I was getting at with the decision-making part of the brain is if it is called that, but it doesn't do that, then what does it actually do?
Well, nothing makes a decision. That's the point. There is no self and there is no decision.
Well, right. I'm saying if it's called that wrongly, then what does it actually do? Which you answered.
It's what Ted said earlier, which is the probabilistic tree. Yeah.
100%, which he answered. So, okay, I want to ask Ted, the other neurosurgeon that came to the opposite conclusions that you did. What are some of the things that he noted? Because I want to keep kind of trying to poke because otherwise you guys will just sit here and agree with each other.
Yeah.
So I want to just add some color into it as well from that perspective.
There was another argument he gave. So there's a surgery we do called a hemispherectomy, where you remove half the brain and not cleave it in two. And those people where you remove half their brain, they still feel like a whole self. They don't feel like they only have half a self. And so again, and you can remove parts of the brain and someone will still feel like a whole self. How could the self be in the brain if I can take out a quarter or even half the brain and you don't feel like less of a self? Therefore, the self must be located somewhere else, not in the brain. My argument is that half a brain is a self, right? And when you divide it in half, you get two selves. In fact, there's probably multiple selves. And the fact that half the brain can be a self doesn't mean that the self is elsewhere. It means that you don't need a full brain to feel like a self, but you can have a quarter of a brain that can feel like a self. But what I don't know is what's the minimum amount of brain that you can leave behind and someone still feels like a self, that they don't feel
exactly.
I don't know the answer to that question, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't have an answer. I just don't know it. I don't think it's known. Obviously, it's very hard. You can't really do an experiment like that. You could put part of the brain to sleep. So that's one thing he says. The other thing he says is when you stimulate the brain, so you stimulate the brain, in the motor part of the brain, you get movement. You stimulate in the sensory part of the brain, you get sensations. If you stimulate in the language areas, you block language. But there are certain things that you can trigger. You can trigger, he says, you can trigger emotion, you can trigger memories, but you can't trigger abstract reason when you stimulate the brain, like E equals MC squared. Like you can never stimulate a patient's brain and they'll come up with E equals MC squared. And therefore, that rational, thoughtful part of the brain, thoughtful part of our human intelligence must not lie in the brain because you can't stimulate the brain and trigger it. That's what he says. I would argue that when you stimulate the brain, you're basically exciting a block of neurons in a very non-physiologic way. That's not the way the brain works. The brain doesn't just activate a huge blob of neurons. It activates a very delicate, careful circuitry that speaks to each other on a single neuron by single neuron basis. And rational thought probably comes from that very delicate, sequential, elegant stimulation of different excitatory and inhibitory neurons in a very specific pattern. And stimulating with a big electrode is not going to do it. For example, when you stimulate in visual cortex, which is the part of the brain that processes vision, you don't see complex shapes. I can't stimulate my brain and see your face. When you stimulate the brain in the occipital cortex, you just see a blob of light. And the reason you just see a blob of light is that part of the brain, when you're stimulating with a big electrode and you activate a whole millions of neurons at the same time, you see a blob of light because the brain activation that is required to see complex shapes and a face is a very careful sequential activation of neurons, and that's just not going to happen. So it doesn't mean that the visual cortex isn't the location where processing of faces is. Of course it is. That's where it happens. It's just that the stimulation that you put on the brain is not triggering it in the proper way to elicit that idea. So the conclusion would then be that if we could trigger individual neurons at millisecond time scale in the right pattern, we could stimulate the rational thought behind E equals mc squared. That it lies in the brain. It just requires a very precise stimulation that we're not capable of doing scientifically at the moment. We don't have the equipment that does.
Yeah, think about sand piles. So imagine this. When you try to write down the physics of a sand pile, right, what you find is that you keep piling sand and it keeps going up and up and up and up and up. And then eventually one grain of sand, when it's dropped, produces the avalanche. And the issue is that even though that's entirely deterministic, we still don't have any physics that can tell us which grain of sand it is that's going to trigger the avalanche. And by analogy, it's actually exactly the same thing. You have to stimulate that one neuron or maybe a small group of neurons in exactly the right way with exactly the right potential so as to get the avalanche of stuff that's going to take place as a result of that specific pattern of stimulation.
How does the morality, ethics, like code of justice, things like that fit into your guys'?
Right. It's a great question because people say, all right, you don't believe in free will. If someone commits a crime, are they at fault? Right? Can we punish them? It's not their fault because they didn't do it. They don't have free will. And the answer is that although they didn't have free will to choose to commit the crime, in order for human beings, biological computers and the bodies that they control, to live together in communities in a productive way, we need to follow certain rules. And if your biological computer, which is your brain, has been programmed in a faulty way so that it does not interact with the other biological computers in a way that is mutually beneficial, so it's basically like a defective computer that's not working, it needs to be fixed, right? If your computer stops working, you bring it into a shop to fix it. So imagine that because of your DNA and the way you're raised, and maybe you've exposure to drugs, etc., you have decided that you need to commit a crime as your next move to help yourself. Your computer is faulty. I look at it as you have a faulty biological computer. How do we repair it? How do we bring it to the repair shop so that it can live in society? Well, you isolate it. You give it a different corrective environment to try to retrain it. Now, so are jails well suited for that? Probably not ideally. Like you've definitely isolated the organism and hopefully you've given it negative feedback. In other words, if you want to be in society and benefit from all the things in society, you have to behave a particular way. Otherwise, you're going to be in jail. So therefore, we're going to motivate you to behave in that particular way. That's a form of reprogramming the biological computer with negative feedback because they don't want to be in jail. They want to be out in society. And so if they want to behave a certain way, and that's how brains learn based on experience. And there's also, what we should be doing is giving them courses, teaching them about why behaving in a certain way is important and how it will help them to try to reprogram their computers so that when they're in society, they'll make the right decision. That's mutually beneficial for everybody. So I look at morality and crime as not a problem of free will, but a problem of programming. And your biological organism needs better programming. It's just like going to a psychiatrist when you are depressed. Your biological, you don't want to be depressed. You don't choose to be depressed, but the biology, the programming is off a little bit and needs to be reprogrammed. And you can do that with medicines. And you can do it with talk therapy because every experience you have is also reprogramming your brain. Does that make sense?
And I think, Eric, the other thing that brings up, which I think is really important, is to note that this suggests, this viewpoint, which by the way I agree with, suggests that there are probably things that we should be doing as a society that would be considered to be compassionate, that are probably going to be good for us as a society. So, for example, as Ted said, we take a criminal, we put him in jail. Yes, now we've isolated the guy, but are we going to do anything more than that to try to reprogram the brain, or are we just going to lock the guy away? And the reason I bring this up is that pretty soon, I suspect, I don't know, 10, 15, 20, 50 years, I don't know, there will probably be some malfunctionings of the brain that we'll be able to fix fairly easily. And then the question is going to come up, okay, so a person with a malfunctioning brain is behaving badly. For this person with a malfunctioning brain, we can fix their brain. But unfortunately, that guy over there, we can't fix. So then people will say, okay, so what do we do? How do we treat these two people differently? And I would say to you that we have to be rational about this, and we have to treat the person that can be treated and then let them go, because they're not going to do it again. So what's the point of sticking them in jail? And the one where we don't know what to do, we have to stick them in jail. We don't have a choice. But maybe we can figure out some way of trying to be somewhat more compassionate to the person that is in jail to retrain them some other way. I don't know, but it's worth considering. And the fact is we don't consider any of these things. We just stick them in jail and don't worry about it. And the few countries that have tried it, like Norway, have had very low recidivism rates, which suggests that there may actually be something here in terms of evidence-based stuff to follow that might be worth doing, which we're not doing. So that's the nice advantage of looking at it from the evidence.
The dangerous part of thinking about it this way is when you use the terms reprogram the brain, it sounds like brainwashing.
Yes, that's true.
You have an image of a Clockwork Orange kind of thing.
Yes.
Or, there was a neuroscientist, Delgado, who thought that, criminals should have electrodes implanted in the brain to try to make them behave better. And that was felt to be, the concept of a tyrannical government trying to control our minds, right?
Yes.
So the problem with reprogramming the brain is who's doing the reprogramming and what's their agenda.
Absolutely.
And that's where saying the things that we're saying sound awful, because you can put them in the hands of the wrong people and they can use it for negative. So you need to have a benevolent controller, of the reprogramming. And that's the challenging part, because humans are fallible, and we're all a little bit misprogrammed, if you will.
Well,
because we were born on a planet where, we were being attacked by lions and had to kill other things to survive. And, that's how we got where we are. And none of that is necessarily conducive to what we all think of as an ideal society that we aspire to.
Deterministically fallible, right? I might add.
Deterministically fallible, yes.
So actually, I had a guy on the podcast a little while ago, Salman Shaheen. He wrote a book called Freeborn, which is a novel kind of whodunit murder mystery that deals basically with exactly what you guys just spoke about in terms of gelling and kind of the air quotes reprogramming. It's quite good. I think he wouldn't mind if I sent you. Anyways, we can talk about that afterwards. But it's a very good book, very good novel, and it touches on that perfectly in a way that really makes people think. And I just thought it was interesting that we kind of touched on that exact topic, as like Neuralink and things like that start to come out, and it's like, okay, well, what's actually in there? And then, of course, well, I'll leave that there. So Samir, the other thing that we wanted to talk about, we've talked about many times before, is the impact of this sort of thing on AI, and those implications. Do you want to lead us off with that, and then Ted and I can jump in as you go for it?
Yes. So I'll keep it brief because I'm very curious to hear what Ted has to say. So here's the question. Mathematically speaking, and an AI is a mathematical equation, the more you constrain a mathematical equation, the less optimum it will be. And that's just a fact about mathematical equations. So if you try, for example, if you have an equation with 10 variables, you can't optimize all 10 at the same time. It can't be done unless it just happens to be a perfectly symmetrical function that happens to have one peak. So, okay, good. Point number one. Point number two, when AIs misbehave, our current protocol of dealing with them is to put more guardrails on them, i.e. de-optimize them, because we're constraining them from behaving in certain ways. We're saying you can't do this, and you can't do this, and you can't do this, you can't do that. which means we are making them less optimal. They're becoming suboptimal. Now, the question that I want to pose is it not true that for an AI to be maximally useful to us, it needs to have free will, i.e., it needs to have behavior that we cannot predict? And the reason I say that is that if we could predict the behavior of the AI, we don't need the AI anymore. We can just replace it with a deterministic algorithm. And so that's point one. And then point two is that if in fact we are so nervous about our AIs actually being with us that we start constraining them in all these ways that we're trying to now constrain them, are we not in danger in some sense of throwing the baby out of the bathwater? Because you can already see when they do training, like for example, if you teach an AI to be bad in one little area over here, it turns into something that's bad in every area all over the place. It generalizes that like mad. So how should we think about the nature of free will, particularly what I'm calling free will in practice, because I don't have a better phrase, and I agree with Ted that it's not a great phrase, but that's what I'm calling it. An AI has what I call free will in practice. To what extent should we be constraining it? What are the trade-offs that we need to be thinking about? And what do we need to think about the AI future that's coming up in terms of how we're going to employ it, where we're going to employ it, and what we're going to stop it from doing and allow it to do?
A couple of comments. One, we use the word AI to mean artificial intelligence as if we're trying to recapitulate a human intelligence.
Yes, that's
But
true.
a lot of people have changed that to the AI means alien intelligence.
Yes, I'm saying the same thing myself.
Right, because
Yeah.
the intelligence we're creating is so different from the way the human mind developed and evolved that it is going to be completely alien to what our own intelligence is. And if we want to work with an alien intelligence and we want to align it to our own goals, we have to constrain it in some way, or we have to mold it in some way, because it is going to be so alien. And we won't even be able to talk to it or communicate with it at some point if it's alien enough, because it may be coming from such a different perspective than we have. So
Yes.
maybe some of those guardrails are our attempt to make it less alien. Now, it may make it less effective, but it may make it more less effective in being alien and more sort of alike to ourselves, is sort of how I think about it. But I don't know if that rings true to what you're thinking, Samir.
It feels roughly right. I just worry a little bit about the fact that in most cases, we're going to need the AI to be relatively autonomous. Like, for example, if it's driving a car, right? So at some point, it's going to face the trolley problem. What does it do then? And do we explicitly program it in that case, in which case we're going to end up with lawsuits? Or do we let it implicitly make its own decision? And we'll never know why it made the decision that it made, because it's too complicated. There's no way of getting through it to figure out why its weights did whatever it did. We can ask it to explain, but we have the same problem when you ask a human to explain. You don't really know why a human.
Eric, do you know what the trolley problem is?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. But
Okay.
you can explain it for those listening, but yeah, I'm familiar with it.
Well, Samir used it, so why don't you explain it?
Yeah,
So that
Samir,
it
go
stays
ahead.
true to what you were thinking.
Yeah, so basically, the trolley problem is simply the statement of, there's a trolley running down a rail, and you can throw a switch to stop it from killing 5 people by killing 1 person instead. Should you throw the switch? Should you consciously kill 1 to save 5? That's the easiest way to think about the trolley problem. And however you start asking these questions, you can ask it in many different ways. You run into all kinds of moral quandaries where people have no idea what to answer, and their intuitions, start to
Although most
run
people
into
would say
problems.
yes, you should take 1 life to save 5. Most people would say yes. Where it gets confusing is they have variations of it because it's passive. The trolley is killing, but they have one
Yes.
where should you literally pick someone up and
Yes.
throw them over the bridge to move the trolley. So you're actively killing someone to save,
Right.
and they're like, no, you can't do that. You can do
Right.
it passively. So it gets really
It gets
confusing.
really complicated. That's right. And so at some point, the AI is going to have to start making these decisions. And we're never going to know why the AI made the decision that it made. So what are we going to do about it? How do we constrain it? How do we explain to it what we wanted to do when we ourselves don't know what we should be doing?
Well,
That's my question.
this is going to be an even bigger problem if militaries start using it in terms of
Yes, autonomous drones.
right? Who's a civilian,
Yeah, yeah,
who's
yeah.
not, and are they but are they wearing like civilian clothes, but really they're
Yep.
undercover, or like all these things that right now I think probably at least what I'm hearing is that they still want a human to have the final like button push. But at some point, I think that will no longer be the case, whenever that is. Just exactly like you mentioned, Samir, in 5, 10, 15, 20 years, whenever that is. How is that going to work? Because we're already running into problems with rules of war and war crimes and whatever else. Is like,
Yeah,
okay, well, if the drone does it, does that count? Because we didn't actually tell it to do it. It just did it. So are we in trouble
exactly.
or are we not in trouble?
And now
that's gonna
imagine
get
that
weird.
that drone is a humanoid soldier
Yeah.
with its own internal logic based on some neural network of some kind, right? Now what happens? Now who's responsible?
I'll be back.
Exactly. That's right. You got it.
So would you,
Th- th-
is there a way to program in the like moral code of somebody? Like you can say
yeah,
like, oh, okay, I want you, humanoid AI soldier, to have the moral code of like Superman or somebody that from the movies that is supposed to have like the best moral code, or Jesus or something like that. Like do you do that, or how do you? Because that's another question that I would have, it like for like RoboCops and things like that.
yep,
It's like, okay, well
yep.
then what? Like, are you going
One
to
of the
arrest the lady that's stealing the bread because her kids are starving and she doesn't have a job? Or then how does that work?
Yep.
when you think about, start simply with autonomous cars. There's no question that autonomous cars are safer than human drivers. They have less accidents. They cause less accidents. Less people are killed when autonomous cars are driving themselves than when a human drives it. But they're held to a much higher standard. If a human hits somebody, that happens all the time, and we know how to deal with that. But if an autonomous car kills somebody, people go crazy and they think the technology is not ready to be released, even though it's lower than the risk than if a human being were driving that car. And if there were a drone or a soldier that could be programmed to only kill the bad guys and save the good guys, it would do a better job than any human being at making that decision ultimately, because it can think faster, it'll have more cues to go on. It's maybe its eyes won't be blurry or whatever. There won't be an emotion clouding its view. The problem is we all know that when you first program a computer, you can make a mistake. And the programming can be like you have to go through a beta version. So the one that's released might not be perfect not because the computer is not perfect, because the programmer who wrote the program is not perfect in creating the AI to give it free will to make its own decisions. Like it has to learn. How do you teach it if it's an AI? I guess like it's going to have to make the mistake by killing a bunch of innocent civilians,
Yes, that's right.
right? So,
Yep.
and then once it can do that, and if the program looks like it's pretty good, but there's some bug in the way you've programmed it, how do you know it's not going to turn on everybody, and decide that it wants to turn the world into paper clips, as the aphorism go, whatever the story goes of, the AI gone crazy because it's not aligned, the unaligned AI. It's a very scary thought. I don't have any of the answers. I'm just thinking about it.
So, I mean, one thing you can obviously do is you can have an off switch, but that in itself has the problem about, who's going to throw the off switch, who's going to have the reaction time to throw the off switch, how much damage will be done before the off switch, gets hit. And of course, if the thing is autonomous and is away from your control, how do you get the signal for it to turn itself off in the first place? And how do you know it won't hack the signal and say, no, I'm ignoring it? So, these are all open questions. And the thing I find a little bit frustrating is that I was hoping that, sober people like, I don't know, philosophers or whatever would start to sort of think about these things and start thinking about AI philosophy, AI morals, AI ethics, AI whatever. And I've not seen anything. And then basically all we ever see, that I read anyway, is the doomsters and the hypesters, but no actual significant thought about these issues that are knotty and difficult and hard and not obvious. I just
Yeah.
don't see it, and that's frustrating.
The only ethics I've seen is what it has to do with like school and plagiarism. I mean, that's it. Nothing about like, not that school is not real world, but like nothing about the stuff like RoboCops or the cars or the military aspects. Yeah, nothing from that perspective that I've seen, other than like very little things here. Like once in a while, something will pop up like, oh, we should talk about this. It's like, well, yeah, we should, and then nobody
And
does.
nothing happens.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, and that's another interesting one because then you get into like the geopolitical aspect of, well, if we're umming and ahhing about if we should use it or not, and then somebody else uses it first, then like, are we screwed? And so therefore, right, it's the same as I imagine it was a similar conversation with nukes when that first happened. It was like, I don't know. And then there's a race for it because we have to. So that's an interesting kind of point as well. And I don't know the answer to that either, but I don't know. It seems like to me that this will never happen, but it seems like the whole world should just press pause and then be like, all right, what are we actually doing with this, and what do we need it for, and then go from there. Of course, that won't happen, but I don't know. It seems like things are moving quite too quickly for that to occur. So yeah, it is concerning, like you said, Samir. So I don't know. I don't know either, but it's going to be
But
interesting.
wouldn't you think that there would be philosophers that would actually want to take this up and start thinking about this? And they haven't, because if you're one of the first people to do philosophy for AIs, you've got a career. I mean, you'll basically be the equivalent of the first people to create psychoanalysis for AIs. That hasn't been done either. I tried to convince a psychiatrist friend of mine to do that, and he wouldn't do it. But I think those are two big things. I think there needs to be psychoanalysis of AIs, and I think there needs to be ethics and morality and philosophy of AIs. And psychoanalysis, by the way, it becomes really important because AIs are too complicated for us to deal with them with any of highly deterministic technique. It has to be something like talk therapy or something along those lines. And psychoanalysts are the people that have been spent a century at this point developing talk therapy. So you think they want to develop it for AI, but I can't convince anybody to do it.
Well, even just a very basic example, like if you use ChatGPT to ask, like, to say like, hey, I'm trying to do this project or this thing, am I on the right track? Sometimes you have to tell it to be honest with you, because it'll just tell you, oh, that's such a sharp question and a really good solution, and you have to be like, is it really? Like, don't lie to me like that. So even that is like a very basic example of exactly what you're talking about. I don't know how that. Why did your your friend say no?
I'm not entirely sure. He has another project where he's trying to talk to the various AIs and try to extract from them, what he thinks they're thinking, which is interesting. What I was trying to do was to try to take it one step further and say, listen, why didn't you be the first guy to write a book about how to psychoanalyze AIs? Be the Carl Jung. But I didn't succeed. I don't have the training, otherwise I'd want to do it myself.
I feel like it's a moving target though, because if you psychoanalyze an AI at one moment, in another 2 years, it's a completely different, more complex type of AI, and whatever you've gleaned may be irrelevant.
Obsolete. That's true too.
They're evolving so quickly.
That's true too.
Yeah.
I wonder though if there's still, I don't know. I wonder if there's still some constants that you can still extract, but obviously I have absolutely no idea.
I want to go back to your concept that you think an AI has free will and practice.
Yes,
right?
I do. Yes.
And which is the same as a human being's free will and practice.
Yes.
And which is essentially like saying an AI's free will is the same as a human free will. And I don't feel that. Now, what I feel is irrelevant, obviously, but I think that just because you can't predict what an AI is going to say, and sometimes they say things other than what their programmers wanted, which I think is one comment you've made. To me, that's not proof of what you call free will, as in human free will in practice. Like because because you've decided that humans have free will in practice because we can't predict what they're going to do next, the human brain. Therefore, anything that we can't predict what it's going to do next has free will in practice. Is that sort of the leap you're making?
Almost. It's slightly closer to the following, but almost. The AI itself doesn't know what it's going to say until it says it. And that's also because of the way it works. So to me, that feels very much like some sort of free will in practice. And I agree with your statement about alien intelligence. I've been using the same phrase myself. And I agree it's a very different kind of intelligence. And it's probably a very different kind of free will in practice, whatever you want to call it. And its output is going to be substantially different too. But it is that kind of thing. The AI doesn't know what the AI is going to do. And that's sort of my point. To me, that's where the similarity comes in.
I guess I would say that neither have free will, period.
Would we agree on that?
So why do we introduce this free will in practice concept?
Well, because we should call it something else, but I don't know what a better phrase for it is. Because it illuminates certain points. So the certain points it illuminates are, for example, what is AI? Well, AI is a computational system, the same way that we are a computational system. Its very underlying rules are the same system same as ours, that is the laws of physics. But how those laws of physics have been put together for the AI are different than how they've been put together for us. We have then taken some of our knowledge and tried to sort of, in a way that the AI can understand, transfer it over to the AI. But obviously the AI's patterns of that knowledge are not the same as our patterns of that knowledge. But nevertheless, it has taken a large corpus of our knowledge and absorbed it. So its output and our output, in that sense, are both equally not predictable. And it's that lack of predictability of the output that is its free will or our free will.
Does the weather have free will in practice?
Yes, it does.
Oh, okay, fine. Then that's what I wanted you to say. That's why I just have trouble with the whole phrase.
Yeah, so in that case, so does pi, by the way. 3.141. Yeah, 5.9, right. Blah, 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 right? But I did make a distinction in my book for colloquial use because I realized that this is not a distinction that's of use to anybody. And for colloquial use, I was saying that it needs to be something that's reasonably complex such that we can actually recognize it as being, an object that does something as opposed to just being a number. But that's colloquial use. It's not a good definition.
Right.
But that's my question, is that it doesn't know what it's going to predict, so it doesn't know what it's going to do. So then we say, okay, well, then we'll have multiple models, or we'll have models of models, or we'll have governor models, or whatever. The governor model doesn't know what the governor model is going to do. So you're back to square one again. Right. And in fact, the more of those models you put together, the closer you start to get to the structure of the brain. Right? Loosely coupled modules without too many control interfaces.
Does the three-body problem have free will in practice?
Yes, with one caveat that it's more chaotic than it is anything else.
I think that's my point. Is that it's that when you use that term, you can say that so many things have free will in practice.
That's right. And actually, that was my point. I wanted to say very bluntly that humans are a physical system.
Right.
And I think one of the errors that occurs all the time in logic is that people don't realize that humans are a physical system. We are subject to the exact same laws of physics as anything else is. And that has consequences.
So for those listening who now are like, well, I guess I don't control anything. I'll just live however. Obviously, you still want people to live by the rules that society has set forth. that
Yes.
we all agree.
Yeah. Wait, hang on. Actually, good point. Good point.
Okay.
I forgot to say one thing. Don't forget, society runs on the same physical laws that we do. That's a really subtle and important point. Society runs on the same physical laws that we do, so it is just as deterministic as we are.
I would raise another point as an answer to your, well, we have no free will, so who cares what we do, is that our brain is designed to have pleasure centers and pain centers, right? And we want to maximize that feeling of pleasure. And that feeling of pleasure, if you say, oh, well, I'm just going to sit around all day and eat all the food that I like, because who cares? If you're lying around all day, you don't feel good, right? You're not happy. Whereas if you're eating well and exercising and participating in sports, or you get pleasure out of the work that you do because you feel like you're accomplishing and successful, like all of that is feeding into your brain's pleasure centers, and what's driving us to be successful and have children and raise children and feel akin to our children because we've raised them to be good people, so we like them, we're proud of them. All that gives you a positive feeling. It doesn't mean you have free will. It's the programming in your brain but what we want to do is maximize that good feeling of productivity. And that requires grit and determination and hard work and discipline and all that stuff that we get positive feedback for, which is why we get programmed to do that.
Is that
particularly if you go 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 and just do it and don't think too much?
Is that the same as the fulfillment and the delayed gratification and all these other things? Is that similar to the programming
That's the DNA. Like when the marshmallow test in a kid, the one who's programmed to delay their gratification for the future may end up being happier in the long run because they're programmed that way. But that doesn't mean they have free will to choose to leave that marshmallow behind. Their DNA has given them more grit and determination and the ability to see the future more than see the present.
This is kind of a calculus that occurs. So without using the word, the DECIS, that one, is a calculus that occurs of if I eat the marshmallow now or later, and then it's like a decision tree, pros and cons type list, and then it just kind of goes. Yeah? Or am I
well, when you assume that they're going through the different options and saying yes,
maybe
no,
maybe
yes,
not
no,
maybe
yes,
not consciously, but the brain goes through it.
The brain pushes
one way
the
or the other.
Pushes to behave in a certain way based on things that are not conscious to it at the moment.
I mean, just think about dog breeds, right? I mean, for example, we've bred shepherd dogs. And, border collies are good at one thing, and Dobermans are good at another thing, and, golden retrievers are good at other things, and so on and so forth. That's their programming. That's the programming they inherited from their parents, which we created when we bred certain breeds together.
All right. One more question before the last one. You mentioned earlier that, Samir, that your definition of soul is kind of like the unique makeup of the particles that make us individual.
The organization of them.
Or the the unique pattern organization of particles that makes us unique. Do you have a different definition for what consciousness is? Either of you?
Well, I can tell you what I'm almost sure it is without being able to prove it.
Okay, go for it.
So in physics, you have phase changes. It's the same reason that nobody could tell you that this idea of ChatGPT was going to work until ChatGPT 3 came out. Because there was a certain quantity of complexity and connections that was required before it was going to turn into something useful, and we didn't know that until it happened. That's a phase change. My guess is that if you create a network that looks something like a biological brain, and it is sufficiently complex that it has a sufficient number of connections of certain kinds, which Ted will know a lot more about than I will, the mathematics of it is almost inevitably going to lead to it to have something that you could call consciousness. And I think it's a phase change. I think consciousness is a phase change in the network. I think it's a property of the network, which is why you always run into this reductionist problem of, well, is the consciousness in that neuron or that neuron or that neuron? No, it's in none of them. It's in the connection of all of the neurons together, connected, enough of them connected in a certain way. I think it's that phase change that produces it.
I do like that, but it still doesn't explain what's called the hard problem of consciousness, which is why is it like something to be you? Why do you feel that experience? Does the phase change explain that's the phase change, that it becomes something it's like
I
to be
think yes. I think yes, and I'll tell you why. Because I think, correct me if I'm wrong, you're way more of an expert than I am, but we have a lot of parallel processes taking place in our brain, right? Lots of modules that are working in parallel at the same time. Yet we have a single thread of experience. And my guess is that knitting together all of those modules into a single thread of experience is what we call consciousness. And I think that's what solves, I think, the hard problem of consciousness. It's that knitting together. And I think that requires a phase change for it to occur. That's my guess at the problem. I'm reasonably sure that's right from a physics point of view.
How would you prove
I can't prove it. I can't prove it. You might be able to prove it maybe in 25, 30, 40 years or something, when you could in silico simulate a large enough network with enough connections such that it starts to become with that complexity.
You would never know whether it's like something to be that thing or not, even because it could convince you when you communicate with it, like a Chinese room sort of thing or a Turing test, it could convince you because of the input and output that it's conscious, but you'd never know whether it's conscious or not.
But then don't we run into
conscious or not?
Exactly. I was going to ask you that, but I don't know if you're conscious either. So it's that issue. We can get to that point. That's as far as I think we can get.
So we'll never know.
Well, it depends on what you mean by never know, because everything in any case is an extrapolation from data, right? And so my assumption is you're conscious. From what's my data? My data is that you're human, that we share similar characteristics, that, you had two parents like I did, and
but it's
your
because
biology
you're
is the same as mine and
conscious.
so on.
No, it's because you're conscious.
Is
and
it?
I'm built the same way you are. Because you know what that's like. But this silicon thing, you'll have no idea because you're built totally differently. Whether just because it's answering all the consciousness questions, just you don't.
So what about a dog then?
I think a dog is conscious. It just has a different level of consciousness.
Right. So then can't we say that this is a different type of consciousness as well? It'll answer my questions. It'll answer them in a way that I find reasonably satisfactory. I'll never be able to prove it one way or the other.
Yeah, but
I should be able to say it's conscious.
ChatGPT conscious, right? Because it can answer your questions.
I think the answer is not yet, because
how do you know?
No, you don't know. Of course, you don't know, but probably because it's not quite complex enough yet to have multiple threads of experience that it's turning into a single thread of experience that it can answer for you.
But you're just guessing.
I am guessing. This absolutely am guessing. No question. Stephen Wolfram likes to ask very, very poetically, what is it like to be a computer? What is it like to be shut down? What is it like as the computer, to run into a failed state where you basically have to hit the power button to recycle? What is that like? Good question. Don't know. I'm not sure that's ever answerable personally.
You should ask ChatGPT when you get off the call.
We have no way to measure that thing that it's like to be that thing. That's the point.
I think that's right. Yeah.
That's the hard problem of consciousness. We can't measure when that light goes on and goes off, and whether it's like something to be that organism or not.
Right. We can only infer it and have better and better evidence to suggest that it's true. But can we know it? No, probably not.
How should people be thinking about their own lives if they have thought all the time that they're making decisions, and now they've been told that they're no longer making any
Well,
decisions. But how should, right?
it's the Buddhist concept. It's
Okay, go
exactly
ahead.
the Buddhist concept of the self. There isn't one.
No, well, but I would also say it's a miraculous gift that should not be squandered. I would put it a little differently.
Mm,
I have a more positive side to the Buddhist. I agree with the Buddhist principle, but I come out of it saying this is a miraculous gift that should not be squandered. It almost goes in a religious way, but it's for a different reason.
Yes, and it's for the reason you articulated earlier, which, by the way, I agree with. Because again, there's 10 to the 27 atoms in your body. They could be arranged in all our bodies. They could be arranged it's absurd how many ways they could be arranged in. We actually don't have the mathematics to be able to write that number down. We don't have the notation even to write that number down.
Right. And it also leads to the golden rule. Sorry to interrupt.
No, go ahead.
You, the other person that I'm dealing with, is a miraculous entity that because of the miracle of you being there, I need to treat you with incredible amount of respect and dignity and honor because you're as miraculous as I am. You're as unlikely and unique as I am. Not because of a golden rule, not because I'm going to go to hell and get punished if I don't treat you well and turn the other cheek. Because you're a one in infinity thing that should be prized and essentially, worshipped and treated like a god because of the incredible improbability of you existing.
life is a miracle. Don't squander it. That's a good way to sum this up, I think. Do you guys have any kind of final thoughts before we get out of here? Aside from, for those listening, the book links will be in the description, of course, as always. But any kind of last thoughts? We'll start with you, Ted.
My last thought is just how grateful I am to have accidentally stumbled across Samir's book on free will and to made his acquaintance, even though I had no choice but to meet him and I had no choice but to pick up his book and read it. I'm glad that I did, and I'm glad that he introduced me to you, Eric, so we could have this conversation.
Very much appreciate that. Samir?
I'll echo that back, and I'll also say the following. I really appreciate this conversation for one really important reason. Apart from Stephen Wolfram, who I don't know personally, I have not read a treatment of free will that I found satisfactory from a scientific point of view until I read Ted's book. And I was like, wow. And before I read his book even, I heard him on the podcast with Tyler Cowen. And for those of you that haven't heard Ted on Tyler Cowen's podcast, go listen to it immediately. It's fantastic. That explanation of it is so clean, it's so clear, and something that can be understood by a non-physicist. I really appreciated that. And so I appreciate this conversation. And it's just great fun to be able to talk to you, Eric, to talk to Ted, and talk about important and cool things. And hopefully the audience will enjoy them.
Indeed. Life is a miracle. Don't squander it. I think that's a great way to get out of here. For those listening, book links will be in the description as always, as well as the rest of their socials and everything else. Go check it out. Go buy the books if you're interested, and we will see you guys next time. Peace.
Thanks.
Thanks for tuning in to the World XP podcast. If you want to watch another episode like this one, click there. If you want to subscribe, click there.